Hi, thank you all for joining this afternoon. I'm Laura McDaniel, and today our team is going to talk with you about the Obligation Interim Final Rule for the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program recently released by Treasury. Throughout this presentation, we'll refer to the Obligation Interim Final Rule as the Obligation IFR. The Obligation IFR revises the definition of obligation and provides additional clarifications and guidance to recipients. Following along in the Obligation IFR Quick Reference Guide, as well as the Obligation IFR itself, will be helpful to you as we go through this presentation. The slides and the video recording of the session will be available to you after the session. Today, we'll provide a brief background on the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program, followed by an overview of the Obligation IFR. Then we will go into further detail by reviewing the guidance in the Obligation IFR and providing examples of how you may apply it to your implementation of state and local fiscal recovery funds. Finally, we will review the guidelines for the 30-day public comment period, which will begin after the Obligation Interim Final Rule is published in the Federal Register. Before we go into details, I would like to turn to the SLFRF Program Director, Vero Soto, for some opening remarks. Vero?
Thank you, Laura. Well, good afternoon, if it's afternoon in your time zone, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Veronica Soto. I go by Vero, and I'm the SLFRF Program Director. I've been with the program since August, but I have been in the Office of Treasury here in a previous role for over a year. And I'm very happy to be able to have you join us. I want to start by expressing my gratitude, my thanks to all of you for working so hard on implementing the SLFRF program. Every time we have reporting due, we put out a blog about the things we see in the data that you submit to us. And we highlight examples of the great work that many of your communities are doing. For example, in the July 2023 data release, the Treasury blog mentioned that the city of Bakersfield, California is budgeting $9 million in SLFRF funds to support long-term housing security, including the development and rehabilitation of affordable housing involving new construction and infill development. And that investment is just one of over 2,760 projects funded with SLFRF for affordable housing. We have over 17.7 billion of funds budgeted in this expenditure category. In that blog, we also highlighted Okaloosa County, Florida, where they're utilizing $2.5 million on a two-phase project to expand affordable broadband service. And that is one of over 12,000 projects utilizing SLFRF funds for infrastructure, water, sewer, and broadband projects in their communities. So these two projects are only two examples of the many thousands of projects that are helping communities build on an equitable recovery through the use of SLFRF funds. We know those projects make a difference in your communities, and we know that you want to administer and implement the program to the best of your abilities. And so we want to acknowledge all the questions we have received around implementation, around the obligation definition. We know there was a lot of diligence in getting detailed feedback to us, asking questions, giving us real examples. All of those are issues you faced as you're trying to implement the program, and the feedback on the obligations deadline and the issues you're facing were critical in helping develop this IFR. And so I want to thank you for those questions, and I want to thank you for all the work you're doing to implement the program. So with that, we're going to go ahead and talk about the obligation IFR. And so I want to start just a review of the program, highlighted a couple of examples, shared the blog in terms of the data we see. But as you all are aware, in the next slide, in 2021, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act into law, and that has resulted in one of the strongest and most equitable periods of economic growth in a century. The American Rescue Plan included the state and local fiscal recovery funds, or as we call it, the SLFRF program. And if I stumble with those initials, forgive me, it's hard to say, but easy to love. And so the SLFRF program delivered $350 billion to states, territories, localities, and tribal governments across the country to build a strong, resilient, and equitable recovery. To date, more than 99.99% of the funding of that $350 billion has been distributed to more than 30,000 recipient governments. The obligation IFR we're discussing on this webinar today relates to the SLFRF award funds that your government already has received. Congress has not appropriated additional dollars to the SLFRF program. Recipients can find information on the 7 eligible use categories, on reporting requirements, and other key resources on Treasury's website at treasury.gov/SLFRF. And in this slide, we have some important documents that recipients can access to learn more about the SLFRF program. So we'll go on to the next slide. And this is important because it's part of the reason we wanted to get this obligation IFR out, because the deadlines matter. So now we will review the timeline for using SLFRF funds. And I saw a question, and I hope that this slide, I saw a question in the Q&A. So I hope this answers that question that I saw. So award funds may be used for costs incurred from March 3rd, 2021 for all eligible uses except emergency relief from natural disasters, surface transportation projects, and Title I projects. For these uses, funds may be used to cover costs incurred beginning December 21, 2022. The reason for these different dates are because Congress enacted changes to the eligible uses at different times. For all 7 eligible uses, recipients must obligate SLFRF funds by December 31, 2024. We're going to say that date many times throughout this presentation. So again, for all 7 eligible uses, recipients must obligate SLFRF funds by December 31st, 2024. Recipients must expend, that means spend, the SLFRF funds that are obligated for all eligible uses, except for the surface transportation projects and Title I projects, by December 31, 2026. For the latter category of uses, the surface transportation and Title I projects, recipients must expend SLFRF funds by September 30th, 2026. With that background, we will now move to the discussion of the obligation IFR. And again, in the webinar chat and in the Q&A, we had the links to the IFR quick reference guide, as well as the obligation IFR itself. So moving on to the next slide here. Last week, Treasury issued the obligation interim final rule. We're using the initials IFR to refer to it. So the obligation IFR, and this was issued to address recipients' questions regarding the definition of obligation and to provide related guidance and clarifications. These are the many questions that many of you have submitted to us. We heard requests for clarification from many of you regarding the definition of obligation in Treasury's rule. So this obligation IFR provides clarity in 3 areas. First, we do revise the definition of obligation. Second, we do address the application of the obligation deadline to subrecipients. And third, we share information about how recipients can amend or replace contracts or subawards after the obligation deadline of December 31st, 2024. I told you you're going to hear that date a lot. So that's another time that we use it, but you're going to hear it many more times. So these next 2 items are also important. So first, this obligation IFR does not alter the eligible use categories, including the revenue loss eligible use category. Second, this obligation IFR does not alter the obligation or expenditure deadlines for the SLFRF program. The deadlines we discussed on the previous slide remain in effect. If your government has already expended your SLFRF funds, the obligation IFR does not impact your government. If your government has already obligated all of your SLFRF funds, or your government has a plan to obligate the funds by the deadline, this obligation IFR may provide helpful clarifications to you, but your government may not need to take any action in response to this obligation IFR. If your government has been seeking clarification on these questions, there may be action required, which will be discussed in the course of this presentation. So once again, I want to thank you for your diligence and your attention to the SLFRF program and for all the wonderful work you are doing to help your communities. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Carrie Ann Corrales, from our policy team that will walk you through each of the 3 areas that I have discussed. Carrie Ann.
Hey y'all, good afternoon. As Vero mentioned, my name is Carrie Ann Corrales. I am on the SLFRF policy team based here in Chicago. I'm going to take y'all through the 3 sections of the obligation IFR. We're going to go into a little more detail, but as Vero and Laura mentioned, also please reference the content of the actual obligation IFR as well as the quick reference guide. So first, we're going to dig into the first section, which includes the revision to the definition of obligation. For each clarification, we're also going to provide some case studies to demonstrate how the clarifications might affect your work. As a reminder, again, please always check back with the obligation IFR for additional details, and you can continue to add your questions into the chat box. But before we jump in, we actually want to provide a little bit of background. In the authorizing legislation for the SLFRF program, which are sections 602 and 603 of the Social Security Act, provided that SLFRF funds may only be used to cover costs incurred by December 31st, 2024. In the 2022 final rule, Treasury implemented the statutory requirement by providing that a cost is considered incurred if a recipient has incurred an obligation for the cost by December 31st, 2024. Treasury defined obligation in the 2022 final rule as an order placed for property and services and entering into contracts, subawards, and similar transactions that require payment. This definition was based on the Uniform Guidance definition of financial obligations. Treasury received a lot of inquiries regarding that definition of obligation. In particular, we heard from recipients that they expected some difficulty using SLFRF funds for expenses associated with the administrative and legal requirements of the SLFRF program after the obligation deadline has passed. For example, recipients had expressed some difficulties with providing payroll and benefits for personnel responsible for compliance and reporting associated with the SLFRF program and the expenses of maintaining records, because often government budgeting practices and financial practices obligate personnel expenses when the work is performed. Because of that, the obligation IFR revises the definition of obligation. If we can go to the next slide. So as mentioned, an obligation continues to mean an order placed for property and services and entry into contracts, subawards, and similar transactions that require payment. The first part of this definition is unchanged. However, in the obligation IFR, we've added a second part to this definition. Listen closely. An obligation also means a cost to meet a requirement under federal law or regulation or a provision of the SLFRF award terms and conditions to which the recipient becomes subject as a result of receiving or expending SLFRF funds, or put another way, when recipients incur costs related to the legal and administrative requirements of the SLFRF award funds. Recipient is considered to have incurred an obligation by December 31st, 2024, if a recipient is using SLFRF funds for the requirements described in the definition. So this would include expenditures related to reporting and compliance requirements, single audit costs, record retention and internal control requirements, property standards, environmental compliance requirements, and civil rights and non-discrimination requirements. All of those are also listed on your screen. Also to mention that there's a little bit additional detail about each of these, again, included in the obligation IFR. What this means is that recipients can meet the definition of obligation for these eligible costs without having to enter into a contract, subaward, or similar transaction that requires payment, and can continue to use their SLFRF funds for these costs that would occur between January 1st, 2025 and December 31st, 2026. Next slide. So the obligation IFR includes guidance for reporting SLFRF funds used for these costs. Again, Treasury will update the compliance and reporting guidance prior to the April 2024 report period to describe how recipients will need to report these estimates in the project and expenditure report. But generally, recipients will first be required to determine the amount of SLFRF funds estimated to be used to cover such costs. Second, recipients must document a reasonable justification for this estimate. Third, recipients must report any amount to Treasury by April 30th, 2024, with an explanation of how the amount was determined. And fourth, recipients must report at award closeout the final amount expended for these costs, which will be reconciled against the estimate, and any unused funds will be returned to Treasury. Next slide. Great. In addition to revising the definition of obligation, the obligation IFR states that Treasury considered some recipients' comments to revise the rule to define cost incurred by reference to recipient appropriation, budget, or allocation processes, and explains that this approach would not provide a standard that could be applied consistently across recipients. And second, there's an additional clarification associated with the definition of obligation that states that to the extent that recipients have been covering such administrative and legal expenses under their indirect cost rate, which might include a current negotiated indirect cost rate agreement established with their federal cognizant agency, or the de minimis rate of 10% of modified total direct cost pursuant to 2 CFR 200.414F, the obligation clarifies that recipients can continue to do so, essentially saying that recipients can continue to charge indirect costs throughout the period of performance. Recipients should include indirect costs in their estimate of legal and administrative costs reported to Treasury. Now we're going to go through some case studies to illustrate what all of this means. So in the first case study, we have a recipient that has hired additional finance, contract, and reporting staff that are funded directly by SLFRF to manage the compliance of SLFRF funded projects. The recipients established internal policies and procedures obligate personnel costs when the work is performed. The question is, given the recipient's established practice and policy regarding when personnel costs are obligated, can this recipient incur personnel costs related to the administrative and other legal requirements, such as managing the compliance of SLFRF funded projects between January 1st, 2025 and December 31st, 2026? Our response is yes. The obligation IFR amends the definition of obligation to include costs meeting SLFRF reporting and compliance requirements. Again, additional information on that can be found in the obligation IFR. In our next case study, we have a recipient whose legislative body approved the proposed appropriation of all the recipients' SLFRF funds in 2022. The question is, does this appropriation meet Treasury's definition of obligation? The response is no. The obligation IFR states that Treasury considered some recipients' comments to revise the rule to define cost incurred by reference to recipient appropriation, budget, or allocation processes, and explains that this approach would not provide a standard that could be applied consistently across recipients. In case study number 3, we have a recipient that is using SLFRF funds to provide mental health services to residents that have been impacted by the pandemic. The recipient has hired 8 full-time employees funded by SLFRF to implement the program, which includes social workers to deliver mental health services and case management. The recipient's established internal policies and procedures obligate personnel costs when the work is performed. And so their question is, given the recipient's established practice and policy that obligates personnel costs when the work is performed, can this recipient incur these personnel costs between January 1st, 2025 and December 31st, 2026? The response is that, as was contemplated by the definition of obligation, Treasury recognizes that recipients may obligate funds through other means than contracts or subawards. So, for example, in the case of personnel costs. In these circumstances, recipients must follow state or local law and their own established practices and policies regarding when they are considered to have incurred an obligation and how they document those obligations. Recipients should again follow state or local law and their own established practices and policies, and should not establish new policies or procedures specifically to address this requirement for SLFRF funds that deviate from those existing established practices and policies. So in this example, the recipient's own internal policies and procedures would not allow the recipient to obligate these types of personnel costs beyond 2024. In case study number 4, we have a recipient that calculates indirect costs after the end of the fiscal year based on their negotiated indirect cost rate agreement that's applied to eligible expenditures for that year. This process cannot be completed until the recipient's expenditures are final, which might not be for 6 months after the end of the fiscal year in June of 2025. The obligation of those costs incurred wouldn't occur until they are charged to the SLFRF program, and indirect costs cannot be charged until they are accurately calculated. So for 2024 to 2026, this won't occur until after the December 31st, 2024 obligation deadline. Can this recipient charge their indirect cost for the years after that deadline of 24 through 26? The response here is that the obligation IFR does clarify that to the extent that recipients have been covering expenses of personnel and other related administrative expenses needed to comply with administrative and other legal requirements under the current indirect cost rate, recipients may continue to do so. So now we're going to move on to the second section of the obligation IFR. We had many recipients that asked whether the December 31st, 2024 obligation deadline applies to subrecipients. Treasury is clarifying that subrecipients are not subject to this deadline. The obligation deadline applies to the recipient of SLFRF funds, and a cost is considered to have been incurred once a recipient enters into a subaward or a contract that obligates the recipient to cover that cost. Recipients and contractors do not need to take any additional steps to obligate funds after entering into the contract with the recipient. In our case study, we have a recipient that has awarded a contract to a subrecipient to provide services for unhoused persons. The contract was executed in 2023 and ends on December 31st, 2026. Does the subrecipient need to take any action to meet the obligation deadline after executing the contract with the recipient? The response is no. The subrecipient does not need to take any additional action, as the obligation IFR clarifies that subrecipients are not subject to the obligation deadline. So our third and final section of the obligation IFR is regarding the amendment and replacement of contracts. That recipients asked how they may, after the obligation deadline, amend or replace contracts and subawards entered into prior to that date. In general, recipients cannot re-obligate funds or obligate additional funds after the obligation deadline. This would include changes to contracts made after the obligation deadline of December 31st, 2024 to accommodate things like change orders. However, after the obligation deadline, for a contract or subaward that was entered into prior to December 31st, 2024, recipients are permitted to replace the contract or subaward if one of the following three situations occur. First, the recipient terminates the contract or subaward because of the contractor or subrecipient's default, the contractor or subrecipient goes out of business, or the recipient determines that the contractor or subrecipient will not be able to perform under the contract or carry out the subaward. 2, the recipient and contractor or subrecipient mutually agree to terminate the contract or subaward for convenience. And 3, the recipient terminates the contract or subaward for convenience if the contract or subaward was not properly awarded. For example, if the contractor was not eligible to receive the contract. There's clear evidence that the contract or subaward was improper, and the recipient documents the determination that it was not properly awarded, and the original contract or subaward was entered into by the recipient in good faith. A contract is considered to be made in good faith if the parties follow the standard procurement or subaward practices, and the contract or subaward was not entered into for the purpose of evading the December 31st, 2024 obligation deadline. As mentioned, Treasury will update the SLFRF compliance and reporting guidance with additional guidance for recipients to report any contract or subaward replacements that occur after December 31st, 2024. In case study number 6, we have a recipient that has awarded a contract for a capital expenditure. In March of 2025, the contractor ceases business unexpectedly. The project is only 50% completed. The recipient wants to enter into a new contract with a different contractor to complete the project. Can this recipient enter into a new contract after the obligation deadline with a new contractor to complete this project? Treasury is clarifying that after December 31st, 2024, recipients may replace a contract or subaward entered into prior to December 31st, 2024 under certain circumstances, which include contractor default, the contractor or subrecipient goes out of business, or the contract was not properly awarded. Again, details regarding that clarification can be found in the obligation IFR. In our final case study, we have a recipient that has obligated all of its SLFRF funds by December 31st, 2024. In the recipient's single audit in June of 2025, the auditor identifies issues with the project. To ensure SLFRF funds are spent in compliance with all requirements, the recipient removes the project from its pool of SLFRF funds. As a result, the recipient now has unobligated SLFRF funds, and the recipient has identified a new use of funds that can be expended by December 31st, 2026. However, the recipient is not certain that the funds can be moved to the new project. So the question is, can the recipient re-obligate funds to ensure all SLFRF funds are utilized in compliance with all program regulations and requirements? Our response is that recipients cannot re-obligate SLFRF funds to a new project after 2024 that does not meet the December 31st, 2024 obligation deadline, such as a new project that does not yet have an order placed for property and services or a signed contract, subaward, and similar transaction that requires payment. So we've gone over each of the 3 areas that the obligation IFR covers, which includes the revision to the definition of obligation that allows recipients to incur costs related to the legal and administrative requirements of SLFRF funds throughout the period of performance. It also states that recipient appropriation, budget, or allocation processes would not provide a standard that could be applied consistently across recipients related to the definition of obligation, and clarifies that recipients can continue to charge indirect cost rates to SLFRF throughout the period of performance. Second, the obligation IFR clarifies that the obligation deadline applies to the recipient of SLFRF funds, and subrecipients and contractors are not subject to the obligation deadline. And finally, the obligation IFR outlines when a recipient may amend or replace contracts and subawards after the obligation deadline. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Laura, who's going to take you through the public comment period.
Thank you, Carrie Ann. So now we will talk about the public comment period and how you can provide comments on the obligation IFR. I'm going to give you an address, so you may want to be ready to take notes if you're listening in on the phone. So following the same process that Treasury used when we launched the program in 2021, we have submitted the obligation IFR to the Federal Register for publication. This approach affords you as recipients the opportunity to submit comments on the obligation IFR over a 30-day period. For those of you who can see the slides, the process for submitting your comments is displayed on the screen, and you can follow along as we review them. For those of you on the phone, you will find the instructions for how to submit comments in the obligation IFR itself and on our website. The IFR was submitted for publication on November 9th, 2023, and will become effective when published. That will also be the beginning of the comment period. So there are two methods to submit your comments. The first is electronically through the federal e-rulemaking portal, regulations.gov. This method will be available once the obligation IFR is published. If you would like to mail your comments, I will give you an address to where to send your comments. Office of Recovery Programs, Department of the Treasury, 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20220. I'll repeat the address again if you're listening in. Office of Recovery Programs, Department of the Treasury, 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20220. Now, this next piece is important. All comments should be captioned coronavirus, state and local fiscal recovery funds, obligation, interim final rule comment. I'll say that one more time. All comments should be captioned coronavirus, state and local fiscal recovery funds, obligation, interim final rule comment. With your comments, please also include your name, your organization affiliation, your address, your email address, and your telephone number. So in general, comments received will be posted on regulations.gov without change, including any business or personal information provided. Comments received, including attachments and other supporting materials, will be part of the public record and subject to public disclosure. Please do not enclose any information in your comment or supporting materials that you consider confidential or inappropriate for public disclosure. So we move to the next slide. That concludes the presentation portion of our meeting today. So as a reminder, the webinar was recorded. I'm happy to share that the slides, including the case studies, are currently posted on Treasury's site, and we can add a link in the chat so that you can find it. The webinar recording will be uploaded to the site as well. Thank you again for joining us today about the obligation IFR for the SLFRF program. Now I'll turn over to your questions.